if you can see my screen. All right, cool. All right, here we go. Okay, bye. Thanks. All right, well, hello everybody for yet another rendition of some beer history through with and with Avery Brewing Company. I'm Travis Rupp. I work in the Innovation and Wood Cellar program at Avery Brewing Company. This evening, hopefully, many of you that are here, I'm sure, are here to hear about ancient brewing and the locations of modern day Turkey and Syria. And hopefully, many of you found out about this event via the Avery social media channels or my own personal media channels as well. But our topic this evening is obviously could be a huge one, and I could go on for a long, long time about this area of the world because we are literally in the region where hypothetically beer began, at least in the Western Hemisphere. The event this evening will last approximately 30 minutes, and then towards the end of it, as we wrap up, I'll do some questions or take some questions as well. And so feel free to add anything in the chat while things are going. But what you're looking at here, and this was the little teaser I put out for this afternoon's talk, was on Göbekli Tepe in Turkey as a location that definitely yields evidence for beer production in the ancient or classical world, and some of the oldest known evidence, in fact, for possible beer production that well predates our prior understandings of domestication of crops and animals, or even communities becoming sedentary yet at that point. But we'll get back to this here in just a little bit as we get started talking about this region of the world. Now, just a little bit, as I like to do, if you've seen my lectures before, I kind of explain what I do. But if this is a first time for you, just to kind of lay out where I'm coming from and my background in the material. Again, I work in the Innovation and Wood Cellar program at Avery, and so I work on new brand development and oversee our barrel aging program and products. But I'm also, as they like to call me, a beer archaeologist. In 2016, we launched the Ales of Antiquity series as a product of my worldwide research that I do. I travel all over the globe researching cultures that still thrive and use alcohol as kind of a mainstay for that community today, but also look deeper into the roots of where those cultures have risen from, and look at ancient beer and try to figure out exactly how ancient peoples and cultures were making various alcoholic beverages, most notably beer. But at the same time, though I do work at the brewery, I also am a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I teach classics, art history, anthropology, and then in 2021 I'll be teaching courses in mechanical engineering as well on brewing. So I kind of have this dual life, I guess you might say. And the Ales of Antiquity series was a product of me putting my two passions and hands together and diving into the material. So I spend the vast majority of my time doing research on beer and beer history. And this evening, this is a fun topic because I haven't really talked on this topic in several years. You'd have to go back probably about 6 or 7 years when I first started really diving into and researching the history of beer, that I worked on the true beginnings. And it's honestly the topic that I get more questions about than any when I'm on the road doing lectures, because everybody wants to know, where did beer actually originate and why? And was it older than bread? A topic I'll touch on in a little bit as well. And usually where we come to, at least in the Western Hemisphere, obviously there's a whole other topic to be explored if we dive into the East. But in regards to Europe, the ancient Near East, or just the Western world, we come to this region of the Levant and Anatolia. And so the actual title for tonight's talk, as you saw, The Beginnings of Beer in the Levant and Anatolia. The Levant, you can see, is a part of what was called the Fertile Crescent of the ancient world, where a large body of food sources were being produced, as well as the development of domesticated crops and animals also was thriving in this region. And I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what the Levant was in a moment. But then also we'll be talking about Turkey in a little bit, what is modern day Turkey, or the ancient region of Anatolia, and what is yielded there. And I think what's quite fascinating about this part of the world is having spent a significant amount of time there and traveled in various regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. You go there today, and obviously, alcohol is not a huge proponent of the modern cultures that thrive in places like Turkey or Syria, due to the primary or the largest base of people being kind of they avoid it, I guess you might say, as a part of their religion. And so it's kind of interesting to think that it's not as hot of a topic in modern culture there today, but it certainly was in antiquity because it's probably where beer began. In this cradle of civilization that did have a very diverse climate, that's also something that's often, I think, overlooked, because when we think of the Middle East as we call it today, we think of desert, and for good reason. It is a very arid climate in most regards. But there was more to it than that. It was quite diverse. And we do know that especially from the 8,000 to 6,000 BCE mark in the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B settlements of this region, that there was a lot of activity going on to domesticate crops and animals. Therefore, we are looking at the place that was the origin of agriculture, barley being one of the first domesticated grains, and certainly emmer and einkorn wheat would follow closely at hand. But before we get to domestication and we consider the fact that they eventually were growing crops purely for the production of things like beer, again, let's talk a little bit about the region that we're exploring today, the so-called Levant, which is somewhat of an amorphous term. It doesn't always very strictly apply to specific border regions, but if you were to look at it today, we are obviously seeing locations like Judea, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and all the way up into the southeastern region of Turkey. Then Anatolia would be the vast majority of what is modern day Turkey today. So just to kind of set the stage for where we're at. Now, for beer production, as we all know, we need cereals. And the cereals that we typically turn to are barleys and wheats. And when it comes to barley in this portion of the world, what is wonderful about barley in general, as in the Latin term, the hordeum vulgare, and hordeum is a term that's often referenced in ancient Latin texts as a mainstay in the cereal of the Roman world. But hordeum vulgare, or wild barley, disticon, is it's very hardy cereal. It can handle just about anything, it seems, at times. Now, the ideal requirements for it are what I show you at the bottom of the screen, but it can grow all over. And in the ancient world, it's known to have thrived in North Africa, Crete, and also Tibet in the east. So it kind of just adapts to wherever it's placed. Now, in terms of its requirements, similar to wild wheat, it likes cool, dry winters with low rainfall. It cannot usually handle frost very well, and it likes rain during the growing period. And then rain at maturity rendered it unfit for malting in many instances, based on temperature and climate shifts as well. What is interesting, though, about barley is, as I said, it's very adaptable. No matter really where you go, you can find barley growing in various regions. It can thrive in Britain, where it's wet and cold at times, but it can also thrive in modern day Jordan, where it's extremely hot and arid. So it's fairly hardy in that regard. But when it comes to cereals and the development of beer as almost kind of a pinion of these early cultures, I turn to a very popular book and a popular author, Jared Diamond, who references how important barley really was to the development of all of these things and the development of nucleated cultures and communities. In Gun, Germs, and Steel, I lift this one very brief quote from the book where he says availability of barley along with other domesticable crops and animals in southwestern Eurasia significantly contributed to the broad historical patterns that human history has followed over approximately the last 13,000 years, i.e. why Eurasian civilizations as a whole have survived and conquered others. And it's interesting and Diamond, I think, is 100% right in this regard. And he goes on to say it potentially even domestication at large is one of the largest mistakes that man ever made, because domestication did lead to sedentary lifestyles, nucleated communities, and then, of course, struggles amidst various societies and cultures over the course of time. I mean, fighting over food does actually lead to a lot of wars in the ancient world. But when it comes to the domestication of barley, meaning that they are finally domesticating it, right? They're growing it for a specific purpose. What evidence do we have of that, or what dates can we throw down for when the ancient peoples of the ancient Near East started to do these things? Well, we first have to look to aceramic Neolithic sites in the Near East. And dates do vary. I will tell you that the various publications or various individuals that write on the topic, we kind of all have a general time frame that we work within, but dates are fluid by sometimes a half a millennium trying to figure this out. Now, there are references to and theories that rye was in fact the first crop that was domesticated, roughly around 10,000 BCE. From about 9,500 to 8,000 BCE, though, most cultures that were in the Levant, or at least in the ancient Near East, even encroaching into Mesopotamia further and further, were gathering wild seeds for food. And this may be for bread or beer, as we'll see in a moment. Barley itself, though, we know around that 8,500 mark, though, in the middle of that, in that bubble where they're still gathering wild seeds, they started to domesticate barley. And the domestication of barley was a process that continuously was developed and refined from 8,500 to 5,000 BCE. A lot of evidence for it at Tel Abu Hurera in Syria, and you can see it on the left-hand side in the map where that exists in the ancient Near East. Why barley? Well, barley is full of nutrients. It's a very nourishing grain. And even today, modern nutritionists put it with balanced starches like rice, balanced starch sources like rice and potatoes is something that's very important for the development and the fruition of various peoples and cultures. Also, why domestication is such a big deal has to do with how it causes the plant itself to evolve. The upper image in this on the left-hand side of your screen are samples or they're measurements of seeds that were wild, gathered and actually unearthed in an archaeological excavation in the ancient Near East. And you can see how small they are. They actually don't have much to them, meaning there isn't much sustenance in them. Whereas those on the bottom are domesticated barleys that have been grown specifically to be much more fruitful and produce much more resource to work with. So in that regard, where is the earliest or location for finding barley, or at least finding wild barley that we know is being gathered and then used for food? Well, one of the oldest ones actually comes from very close to the Sea of Galilee. It's actually on the right-hand side. I have a map here of Israel for you, and Sea of Galilee up here. It's just down to the south. If you see my little cursor on the screen, the Epipaleolithic site of Ohala 2. In the excavations there, and what you see is just a recreation of that site in a museum. But it's some of the earliest evidence of wild barley that was unearthed in an archaeological excavation, and the context of it puts it around 8,500 BCE. Now, the problem in very accurately dating these wild cereal hordes is that the site is heavily debated. Various pieces of scholarship have argued that the site actually shows not necessarily communal development, but human activity going back to 23,000 BCE, 12,000 BCE. So it's quite difficult to put your finger right on exactly when people are kind of settling in this region and growing things, or at least gathering things for food source. But there is evidence of it there in Israel, and noting that it is very far to the north in Israel, right on the cusp of Syria, as you can see, basically right in its backyard. Syria is probably one of the most fascinating locations when it comes to the development in the early rise of domesticated crops that were probably used for beer. What you see on these images that I'm showing have to do with, and I'll kind of just blast through them a little bit quickly so you can get a visual representation. But you can see our site of Abu Hurera there, where there was evidence again of cereal gathering wildly and then eventually domestication. And Syria wasn't always this super arid, dry climate, this desert-esque region. In fact, it once was very heavily forested, and that's basically what you're seeing in this image of what is modern day Syria, that it was very heavily forested region or territory. But right around 9,000 to 8,500 BCE, a major climatic event occurred, and this is what it looked like after that event was over. And essentially, what happened was all the really heavily forested territories were gone, and what there were still pockets of forest or trees present, but what came back in the heavy forested region's place were wild cereals, primarily barleys and wheats that started to thrive in this region. Now, the timeline for that is actually really quite cool. This idea that this happens right around 9,000 to 8,500 BCE, because though somewhat of a rudimentary drawing, it gives you kind of an idea of how man is developing in this territory at the time. If you start at the bottom of the image on your screen, we're going all the way back to 11,500 BP, which would mean basically before present, so 11,500 years ago. But as you work your way closer and closer, you'll notice that they are starting to do what they call cereal and pulse agriculture right around 10,000 BP, so around 8,000 BCE, and then continuously moving forward with the domestication of those crops. And this cereal and pulse agriculture that's going on around roughly 8,000 BCE is probably very much indicative of the clearing out of all those forests in cereal and the replacement in Syria, I'm sorry, and the replacement of all those forests with cereals in those regions. But the question then becomes, which one came first and why, when it comes to why they're cultivating and domesticating these crops. This is an ongoing debate, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to put our finger directly on it. There are those scholars that would say, no, this was purely harvested to make bread and consume it as a food. And then there are those of us, and myself included, I think it is very plausible that an alcoholic beverage was the first thing that actually came out of the gathering and potentially domestication of these crops in these early years. I mean, we too often operate under the presumption that the ancients were dumb and didn't know any better, but they would have figured it out pretty quickly that when they have a bad water source, that's the thing that could be making people sick. Whereas it's been proven that less than 1% alcohol by volume in liquid will kill off, in most instances, almost 99% of the bacteria. So it's possible that it was bread, but I think it's even more likely that it was beer, maybe even coincidentally or happened in a happenstance way that it first was being produced, but then it's starting to be produced on a larger scale eventually. And one of the locations that we know that it was certainly being produced on a larger scale was at the place we started with this evening, Göbekli Tepe. And you can see its location here, this little black box at the center of your screen in southeastern Turkey today, and in ancient Anatolia, essentially, is what we're seeing there. But with Göbekli Tepe, it's a very, very interesting and cool site because it's one of the oldest religious locations that exists in the West, and it also has some really, really phenomenal evidence for food and beer production at this religious site. And it's still being heavily studied today, and an attempt to understand exactly when it was used, how it was used, and why people, as Neolithic hunter-gatherers, were coming to Göbekli Tepe on a regular basis, starting as early as 9,000 BCE. But also, what is just really quite phenomenal about some more recent finds of the last decade is there's also pretty good evidence that there was large-scale brewing going on at this location, and that they had already worked out or standardized malting practices. So malting, what we use in beer, is malt, so cereals that have been basically tricked into thinking they're going to create a new plant. They're soaked so that the seed is regenerated or rejuvenated as it starts to sprout or right before it sprouts. Typically, the seeds are exposed to extreme heat, which kills the seed, but you have a seed that's packed full of all these phenomenal starches and sugars that can be converted into alcohol. And there is evidence of them doing that at this location well prior to our original understanding of domesticable crops that for a long period of time in scholarship It has just been presumed that domestication occurred in the ancient Near East around maybe 6,000 to 5,000 BCE. Places like Göbekli Tepe are making us question that. Now, also in regards to that, like I said, it is a religious site. It has a very interesting and odd arrangement of these circuitous circles or walls that surround these pillars. Many of and most, if not all, if I recall, are carved in some way or bear animal imagery and things. What's been noted by Dr. Patrick McGovern, who is another beer historian working out of Penn, that there's even one that has this wonderful design of a bee on it, and he hypothesized or wondered if potentially that was a commentary on maybe some of the ingredients that might have been used in the beer or could have been used to produce mead even potentially in these early sites. I think it's really interesting because working more in what I do on Greek archaeology, it looks very similar to sites that start to thrive on mainland Greece in Thessaly right around 5000 BCE, like a location called Domini, which is it's just really cool to see this overlap that's going on culturally across the Aegean. But nonetheless, what was also unearthed very recently, and this was mostly out of a publication, I believe it came out in 2012, I think is when this came out. But these troughs were unearthed at Göbekli Tepe, beer brewing troughs at this cultic feasting site. And they are quite large. These limestone vessels are 42-gallon containers, or 160 liters is what they hold. And a study of the carbonized remains that were left behind showed oxalates from grain converted to alcohol. Uh, and it's just a really cool find. I will tell you, there is continued study going on of these vessels because there were some questions as to whether or not all of the oxalates that were found had to be the product of conversion to alcohol. So there's still some questions to be answered. But nonetheless, it's a really cool glimpse into probably some of the oldest beer that was ever produced in the world. Now, the cultivation of grain that was being brought in then, does that mean it was for beer and not bread? We don't have firm evidence of like large scale ovens at the site for bread baking, although I presume they probably were doing that. But it's really quite cool to find these large containers for beer fermentation at the site. But why mass malting and production of beer? Well, as it's been argued, it's because beer can act as social glue. I mean, it still does to this day, right? You get that liquid courage in you, and you're ready to go out and mingle and discuss and interact with other people. And it has been presumed that these early brewing festivals, essentially, were a means to be social glue in parties. But beer was kind of difficult to make, and therefore it was reserved for festivals. Why would it be difficult to make? Well, part of it was that prior to domestication of grains, grain production was basically was being undertaken by going out and collecting tiny, mostly inedible parts, separating grain from chaff, grinding it into a flour. And then, as you saw with the seeds earlier, wild seeds just don't yield nearly as much product to be converted as domesticated ones. So, a hypothesis is that the need for beer sparked domestication of grain because you could produce it more readily and more easily. I think you could, it's not completely out of the question or a stretch to say that that might have caused industrialization of beer. Maybe it is our earliest industry in the ancient West, or at least in the ancient Near East. And, you know, you can maybe even go a step further. Did it spark the rise of civilization via foreign relations and trade, large scale labor needed for it, and also spark industries that had to produce the equipment for it? Because brewing does require and always has required specialized equipment, like jars for soaking during the malting process, boiling, fermentation vessels, so on and so forth. And as a product of this, again, as I indicated before, I think we often forget or we overlook the ability or the possibility that this region of the ancient world could be the producer or the originator of beer, because this is what we think of when we think of the ancient Near East. Here in the Judean desert, Jordan Valley, Masada, the great city of Masada. But at this location around 4000 BCE, evidence was found for it there. There are archaeological excavations undertaken of the site dating to roughly 4000 BCE show archaeobotanical evidence and genetic analysis that actually points to uh, uh, basically the production of some kind of beer in the region, right outside the Dead Sea. And of course, the climate is super arid, these steep, stark cliffs, but it wasn't as though they were hauling it in from hundreds of miles away or trading with even nearby Egypt. In fact, by doing the genetic mapping of the grain, they know that it was being grown a mere 12 miles away and brought in. So this constant need and drive to produce beer may have also birthed other barley varieties, because there isn't just one barley, there are several in the ancient world. And it's even sparked some to presume that maybe around, say, the Sea of Galilee, domestication of these crops maybe even is earlier than some of the dates we're putting out, that maybe we need to move it back to, say, 9000 BCE for early domestication. One location at Masada where they found this wonderful evidence to support it was actually a small cave that's on the side of the mountain where Masada is located. It's called the Yoram Cave. And you can see this brave individual climbing up into that cave. And once they got up in there, they found what we call these chalcolithic kernels, which just means they basically came from the Copper Age that precedes the Bronze Age, and that's a time frame of, we'll say, roughly 5000 to 4000 or so BCE. But in there, they found a whole slew of grain hoards and food source to give us an idea of exactly what they were eating, how these crops were being grown, and allowing us to do that archaeobotanical and genetic mapping and analysis of the cereals themselves. Of course, this leads later on to a massive boom in the beer industry. And obviously, we don't have time to go into great detail with all these things in our brief talk today, but certainly the propensity and popularity of beer in the ancient Near East was rampant, to the degree that when we look at the ancient Greeks or we look at the ancient Romans, who rarely wrote about beer, or if they did, they usually didn't have the greatest things to say about it. In the ancient Near East or in Egypt, they loved it. Their cultures thrived off of it. It was something to be celebrated. And I show you a few archaeological examples of that here with the Ululu beer receipt, or the Himton and Kasi, or even this piece found at Girsu in modern Iraq. That was a Sumerian tablet actually talking about barley rations that were given out for the populace, and in order to turn it into beer, to delve out or divvy out 30 to 40 pints of beer a month for adults, 20 pints for children, so on and so forth. So it's really cool to see how much they celebrated it. Of course, too, as the beer industry is being refined and developed in these territories, it's going to lead more and more to that industrialization of the beer process, the evolution of the brewing process, and the evolution of brewing equipment and infrastructures. Even moving forward to, say, the island of Cyprus, where one of the best preserved drying kilns has ever been unearthed, from the Bronze Age of Cyprus, roughly 1500 BCE, at a site near Paphos. And actually, the entire excavation of that site was undertaken by the University of Manchester, and they actually rebuilt that drying kiln next to it after their analysis, and they used it. They used experimental archaeology, basically like what I do with the Ales of Antiquity, to see what would happen. And it was really quite striking how well this drying kiln worked for the malting of grain, and then they eventually turned it into a beer that they consumed at the archaeological site. But of course, on all these things, there's much more to go into, and possibly a topic for a different time. But at this time, I'm going to end with this topic this evening, and let you guys know that you can always see what I'm up to and what I'm working on. Best to follow me on Instagram at The Beer Archaeologist. That's where I typically post things, but you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter as well. And you can also find out other things about Avery, the Ales of Antiquity series, and generally what I'm doing at any of these various sites or locations. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and stop, and I will take a few questions here. So bear with me for one moment while I pull up my questions, and we'll see what we got today. So bear with me one second. All righty. And Krista, if you're still out there, feel free to fire some over to me via email so I can do these guys. All right. So, got a few things here. Let's see. Looks like for the most part, you guys didn't have too much in regards to questions at this time. Um, but what I will say, if you do have any questions, you guys can always email me. So feel free to, you can email me at my Avery email, travis@averybrewing.com, or you can also feel free to um, uh, email me at my university email, travis.rupp@colorado.edu. And it actually looks like I'm getting a couple emails coming in. So hold up 1 second. Bear with me, guys. I'm still here. They're just coming in. I apologize. Okay, so here are a couple questions I got come in. Proof of beer making or Göbekli Tepe. Uh, yeah, so okay, yeah. So there it seems to be that there's a comment to it. So kind of respond to my own question, but prototype to Monk Brewing. Yeah, kind of. I guess you could kind of see it like that because it was affiliated with or reserved for religious festivals. So you could kind of see it in those regards. I mean, certainly when it comes to monastic brewing, a topic I've also worked on quite a bit, and I'll actually be doing a presentation on that for the Gourmet Brewer, which is a podcast in September. That really kicked off with Saint Benedict, of course, and his attunement to beer production for a means to keep his monastery afloat. Essentially, was the idea. So yeah, I think you can see that overlap. Also from Jim, at what point in human history do you think that fermented beer or similar was known to actually have less bacteria or sickness of regular water? Great question, Jim. I don't know if I can necessarily put my finger on it or pinpoint it, but I think probably right from the outset of them that the first brewing that was being undertaken, it would have been that way. I mean, certainly they're not necessarily cultivating their own yeast yet at that point, or even pitching yeast from container to container, but even the wild bacteria and yeast in the air would have been able to kick in fermentation and give them a product that was quite clean. We've done experiments with it at Avery when we created our ancient Egyptian beer, Kansu Imheb, and it was quite striking how fast fermentation took off, even just using wild yeast. So I would say if they're producing beer as early as 9,000 BCE, I think from the outset, just via the science of it, that was what was going to happen. Was it was going to be a much cleaner product than the water in some instances. Uh, other questions that came in. What is my next talk? Isn't there a Roman beer coming out? Yes, there is. I am pretty much done with the research on Roman Britain, and we're just kind of waiting for a good time to do a release for it because typically I do a lot of events around the release of an ale of antiquity. So with Roman Britain, we'll be canning that beer, making it available for the public, and I hope it's sooner rather than later. But still kind of waiting to hear back from the powers that be on that one. But that one is coming. I also have three other projects that are on just sitting on deck waiting. There is another project that I'll be doing in the UK, a project in Sweden, and then also I will be doing another one for our presidential Ale of Antiquity series on James Madison. So those will be coming up. In regards to my next talk, I'm trying to keep them all straight in my mind. I will be doing a talk for the Longmont Public Library that's also going to be, I think, 100% open to the public in a virtual format. That's going to be on beer in times of pandemic, essentially, or beer consumption during times of illness and plague. So I'll be doing a talk on that. I've got a talk coming up on monastic brewing and my work with the monks in Italy in 2017. That'll be in September. And I'll also be doing a guided tasting for a YouTube video of George Washington Porter, Monticello, and 1752 IPA. So stay tuned for those. And I'll post plenty about that on my Facebook and or Instagram pages. What event changed the landscape from forest to grain? So it's a really good question. Basically, major event that took place during that time caused a huge disruption to kind of all of Europe. It's at this time that it's been presumed it was kind of almost like a mini ice age that settled in and caused disruptions as far west as Britain, France today, in the modern sense, using the modern terms. But that swept all the way across the Mediterranean and caused the devastation of those forested areas that were later replaced. So a pretty major climatic event. Last question is here. What papers talk about beer production at Göbekli Tepe so we can read more? Oh, great question. So most of the material that's come out thus far is via, honestly, just online archaeology websites and sources. So Live Science had posted a few articles on it a couple of years ago. There is a little bit of reference, not much, but there's a few references to it in Patrick McGovern's book, Uncorking the Past, where he talks about his work in the region and compares it to some other locations in southern Turkey, where evidence early on for beer production has been produced. But hopefully more will be coming out. As I said, there was a follow-up to one of the articles, I think that was actually released through Archaeology Magazine in 2012 that said that they're reanalyzing the data to see exactly really what was in those vessels and if all the oxalates are the product of alcohol and or beer. All right, folks, I think that's all. It looks like I got through all of the questions. So, oh, no, there's one more question. What evidence helped conclude that there was malting and brewing at the site in Anatolia rather than just grain storage or something else? So what it came down to was twofold. In the archaeological remains, when we do archaeobotanical analysis, if we find seeds that seem to have been intentionally sprouted, but then exposed to extreme heat shortly thereafter, that's often presumed that they were actually walking through or going through that very specific malting process that's needed for beer. Now, you're right. What about just grain storage? With grain storage, you can certainly still have seeds that will eventually sprout because they can get wet, so on and so forth. But they're not typically then exposed to extreme heat immediately afterwards, which is a telltale sign that they were used for beer production. And then also the other big piece of it was that the finished product that was in those large vessels had oxalates that are known to be created by malted grain conversion to alcohol. And that is what triggered it as presumably being for alcohol or beer production, not simply for grain storage. Okay, that is the last question. So thank you all for attending this evening. I will be doing another one of these shortly, so just through the Avery Facebook page, doing an Avery Facebook Live event. So stay tuned for that. I'll announce it typically about a week or two before the event takes place. But thanks again for joining me, and you all take care this evening. We'll see you on the next go round.